We lost a great teacher of Torah in the Jewish world. We remember Rabbi Jonathan Sachs with love and respect this Shabbat and recall his many, many teachings that truly inspire. Rabbi Sachs explained that there are spiritual milestones on our journeys, milestones that change the direction of our lives. A moment that we wake up to the possibility of being the Jewish soul that only God knows we can be. He believed that about every soul, that there could be moments of hitorut, great awakening, and that the study of Torah and the world's wisdom added unbelievable degrees of dimensionality when it came to building character, when it came to conceiving of ideas for the moment and for our future, and when it came to understanding the very messages of Torah. One of my milestones moments that I recall in thinking about his teaching to watch for those milestone moments was the moment that I met the acting fire chief of the Mechabe Eish in Israel when I was working in Washington in the early 1990s. Turning towards him and explaining that this young Jewish soul was so involved in the fire and emergency services and that I felt it was part of my Jewish identity to be working in the field of life safety and writing speeches for emergency managers to garner more of a budget for their fire and emergency departments. That chief turned around and asked me a simple question. Well, do you know how to speak Hebrew? Do you know your Aleph Bet? Did you learn it once? And I recognized that I was missing a key on my ring, that I could not unlock my Jewish soul nor my own Jewish potential if I didn't have a deeper understanding in some way of the Hebrew language. Not particularly for reading one or another text, not particularly for saying one or another particular prayer, but just so I could explore the great heritage, the gift that was given to me as a Jewish soul. I said, I don't know where I'm going to learn Hebrew in America. And he said to me, that chief, well, go and live in Israel for a year. Not just a week or two. Go live for a year. That was before Birthright, and that was before a teen tour was something in my life that I knew about or conceived of. I was in my 20s already anyhow. And how does a young man get to Israel? At that time, I knew you had to enroll in some type of school, and in the Reform movement in which I grew up, the only option was to try to get into rabbinical school. So they had a program that not only gave you ulpan and taught you how to read and speak, they would give you access to the texts that are at the core of Jewish existence. The texts that I believe are at the core of Jewish existence, because I heard Rabbi Sachs speak once as a college student and say that your bar mitzvah only began the journey. Your adult life, every day, a mitzvah more important than other mitzvot, he would say, is the study of Torah and comparing and contrasting characters within the same book, one chumash of the Torah to another chumash, one part of the Torah to a section of the prophets, and to see what it would look like if you held that up against a section of the writings or a Mishnah or a passage from the Talmud or Midrash. He poetically lifted the entire library of the Jewish canon. And he did so through his many Torah studies that you can find online, that you can hear recorded, that you can download on PDF, that you can read in his many books. And I'll make a reference to a couple of his studies as we are in the Abraham and Sarah chapters of Genesis. And we remember that it all started with, of course, Genesis and the portion of Noah. Rabbi Sachs asked the question about Noah, why wasn't he given the commandments that Abraham was given? Why wasn't he and his wife the Abraham and Sarah of the Jewish people? Why was Noah called a tzaddik, a righteous soul, and only Noah called a righteous tzaddik? And thusly, why wasn't Noah the first Jew? What is it about Abraham and Sarah that we should learn that really defines Jewish existence and Jewish life and a Jewish persona? And is there something yet to learn from Noah? Rabbi Sachs wrote that Noah indeed was someone who was righteous. But, he explained, he was not a leader. In a disastrous age, when all had been corrupted, the world filled with violence, God regretted that he had made man on earth and was pained to the very core. Noah alone justifies God's faith in humanity and indeed allows God to restore the families of humanity. Noah was a good man, a tzaddik, in a rotten age. But his influence on the life of the contemporaries around him was non-existent. That is implicit, Rabbi Sachs explains, in God's statement, "You alone have I found righteous in this whole generation," in the 7th chapter of Genesis. Noah preserved his virtue by separating himself from his environment entirely. And even though one might think, with the notion of Kedusha being about separation and holiness being about being set apart, that one would be able to separate oneself entirely from the environment and the world around you, but that is not the case, as is witnessed and evidenced through the stories of Abraham and Sarah, right from the very start in chapter 12 of Genesis. Rabbi Sachs points out that Abraham turns to God and is ready to go forth with a passion for bringing people into the tent. He and Sarah, according to rabbinic tradition, convert the souls of men and women in Haran. Kol hanefesh asher asu b'Haran. Immediately, the first facet of Jewish persona is accepting God's commandments. The second is to become educators, to become those who share what God intends for the people to do down here on earth, to define a mitzvah mission, to unite around that sense of purpose, that justice must be achieved in the world, that mitzvot, ritual togetherness, must be achieved in order to inspire one another. God knows what's in store, is also a people willing to argue. A people willing to argue with God, even when God makes decisions about what goes on in history. We all have celebrated the incredible conversation that Abraham has with God about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. But the Jewish people themselves are known as a people of a rebellious nature. It says in Ezekiel, "Son of man, I am sending you the Israelites," he says to the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. "To a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me, they and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day. The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, and whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are a rebellious people, they will know that a prophet has been among them. Sometimes it can feel so frustrating to share what we know is right, or at least our own perceptions about what is indeed the godly way, and to have no one respond. God tells Abraham, as God told Ezekiel the prophet, care for the world around you. When you see the palace is on fire, ask, where is the fire and emergency services? Why was their response time elongated here? Could we have garnered more resources to get them here faster? Think systems-wise and think about the individuals. Will they be able to hear you if you are yelling at them and convincing them through cogent, yes, even cogent arguments? Shouldn't they know at first that you care about them and that you see them as being created in the image of the divine? And through the heart comes the potential meeting of hearts and minds. Avraham and Sarah were asked to be leaders, different from Noah and his wife and the family, who were asked to build on spec, who had to be reminded to come out of the ark when it was time. Rabbi Sachs noted in a manuscript of the Midrash Tanhuma, edited by Buber, and he would oftentimes find the gems that were located in the Midrash that were referenced somewhere, but that he just wanted to make sure we knew they were indeed in one of the manuscripts that he had seen in the libraries or received a facsimile edition thereof from one of the prestigious institutions in Britain or beyond, through the Jewish world, where he would do his research. That the Midrash said about Noah, he waited for God to tell him to leave the ark. But that same Midrash quotes Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli, who said, if I had been there, I would have smashed the door down on the first sign that there was any dry land and that we could have gotten right back to the work that was necessary. I would have broken the door down. I didn't need to wait for God to give me permission to rebuild a broken world. And that message, Rabbi Sachs hit home time and again and again. The moral of the story, Rabbi Sachs quoted his teacher, Rabbi Rabinovich, as saying, is that faith in Jewish terms is the willingness to rebuild and build anew a shattered world. We don't wait for God's permission. God gave us permission by calling to us, by making us children of Abraham and Sarah, who pledged to do tzedakah and didn't need to be called tzaddikim. Faith in Judaism, Rabbi Sachs wrote, is to have the courage to pioneer, to do something new, to take the road less traveled, to venture out into the unknown, to take a risk, to overcome fear, and to know that God is with us. To Noah, he said, you're one who has walked with God. Chapter 6, verse 9 of Genesis. But God said to Abraham, walk on ahead of me, in chapter 17. The last face of the beautiful gems that Rabbi Sachs shared about the Abraham and Sarah Torah portions, being that we're in Parshat Chayei Sarah, just let me end with this. Along the same lines, but yet a different aspect of the kind of personal stamina and courage and faith in the future that Abraham represents for us. Parshat Chayei Sarah, of course, begins with the death of Sarah. 127 are her years. These were the years of Sarah's life. The double expression of her years and her life means that her years, and this is a way of my own reading it, her years were her own. She was her own soul. She was her own person. She exhibited strength. She made souls as her husband had. She led a life of commitment to Kadosh Baruch Hu herself. But this was her life, the second half of the verse. These were the years of Sarah's life. That refers to a life in partnership with her beloved Abraham, who at that moment in the Torah portion at the beginning of Chayei Sarah mourns for her, prepares a eulogy for her, cries for her tears that a husband cries for a beloved wife. In that moment, and the Torah reflects this by including a small letter chaf in the word livkota, when he cried for his wife, written in the Torah as a smaller letter kaf in that word livkota, that he so cried for her. Because Abraham's world shrank at that moment. Abraham's sense of God's presence in the world diminished. Abraham's sense of fullness and all life held and could hold. For a moment, it all collapsed. But then he found the strength. Then he found fortitude. Then he found the faith to risk living again. He integrated the loss. One never gets over that. He integrated the love and the legacy and the light of Sarah's being and the way she brought soul life to Am Yisrael, the Jewish people. And he went off to complete the commanded path of life that God had given him at the outset of his journey. He remarried, Keturah, had 6 more children, according to Torah. There are 8 children of Abraham. And finally, through whatever fatherly work he did, his sons Isaac and Ishmael come at the time that Abraham dies to bury him together in that very spot that he had purchased in the Holy Land for his wife Sarah. That sign of reconciliation between cousins, between brothers, is a sure sign of hope for the future among families of humanity, and especially among Jews and all the peoples who live so close by to our beloved state of Israel. The idea that Abraham is a father of many nations that spread out all over the earth with roots in Abraham and Sarah as the deep roots of those families of the earth that spread out beyond and more than at the time of Noah, is an incredible lesson in the shared humanity we have with others, but the true blessing we know as a Jewish people. Faith is the courage to take a risk for the sake of God or the Jewish people, to begin a journey to a distant destination, knowing that there will be hazards along the way, knowing that we will experience loss, but knowing also that God is with us, that God said, "Go out before me," that God gives us strength if we align our will with the divine's. Faith is not certainty, but the courage to live with uncertainty. Faith is being able to continue our study of Torah with the lessons of our teacher, our Rabbi, Morenu v'Rabbeinu, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha. Shabbat Shalom, and Rabbi Sachs' memory for a blessing.